My wife went on a girls' trip with her wealthy friends and came back pregnant. She looked me right in the eyes and called it a miracle from above. But her face turned pale, and the entire crowd stopped breathing when she finally opened the giant gender reveal box and found out exactly what I had been planning. Before we get into this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that betrayal should always be met with absolute justice. My name is Douglas Reynolds. I am 70 years old. I have spent the last 4 decades of my life building a commercial real estate empire right here in the heart of Chicago. When you work that hard for that long, you start to believe that you have seen it all. You think you know how to read people. You think you can spot a bad deal or a dishonest partner from a mile away. But the truth is, the most dangerous betrayals do not happen in the boardroom. They happen right inside your own home, carried out by the person sleeping next to you. I met Paige 5 years ago. I was 65, a widower still carrying the quiet grief of losing my first wife to cancer 10 years prior. Paige was 37 at the time. She was vibrant, sophisticated, and breathed a kind of new life into my world that I thought was gone forever. I knew the cliches about wealthy older men and beautiful younger women. My older son certainly reminded me of them often enough. But Paige was different, or so I convinced myself. Before we got married, we had a very long, very serious conversation about the future. I had already raised my family. I had already built my legacy. I told her I was looking for a companion for my twilight years, someone to travel the world, with someone to enjoy the quiet moments with. I asked her point blank if she wanted children, because if she did, I was not the right man for her. Paige looked me straight in the eye, held my hand, and promised me she had no desire to be a mother. She said she only wanted me. That was the foundation of our marriage, a promise that we were enough for each other. It was a Tuesday morning when that foundation crumbled into dust. I was sitting in my penthouse office. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a perfect view of the Chicago skyline, the city I had helped shape. I was nursing a cup of black coffee and reviewing some quarterly financial reports. The house was quiet. Paige had returned just a month prior from a lavish 3-week girls' trip to St. Bart's. I had paid for the entire vacation, wanting her to relax and enjoy the pristine beaches with her inner circle of wealthy friends. I wanted nothing but her happiness. The heavy oak door to my office suddenly swung open. Paige stood in the doorway. She was wearing a silk robe, her hair slightly messy, her hands trembling violently. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her morning makeup. My first instinct was pure panic. I thought someone had died. I thought there had been a terrible accident. I stood up so fast my leather chair rolled backward and hit the wall. I rushed toward her, asking what was wrong. She did not speak. She simply walked over to my heavy mahogany desk and placed a small white plastic stick right on top of my financial reports. I looked down. 2 solid pink lines stared back at me. For a second, my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. It was a pregnancy test. "Douglas," she whispered, her voice cracking with raw emotion. "We are going to have a baby. It is a miracle. A literal miracle from God." She covered her face with her hands and began to sob, her shoulders shaking with what looked exactly like overwhelming joy. I stood frozen. I looked at the plastic stick, and then I looked at my wife. My beautiful, crying, supposedly overjoyed wife. I slowly walked around the desk and wrapped my arms around her. I pulled her into a tight, secure hug. I stroked her hair and whispered reassuring words. "A miracle," I repeated softly into her ear. "That is exactly what it is, sweetheart. A miracle." But as I held her, pretending to share in her overwhelming shock and happiness, the blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. My heart hammered against my ribs, not with joy, but with the chilling realization of an unthinkable betrayal. You see, for this pregnancy to be mine, it truly would have to be a divine intervention. 15 years ago, after my first wife passed away, I made a definitive decision about my future. The grief of watching the mother of my children fade away had broken me in ways I could never fully articulate. I knew I never wanted to start over. I knew I never wanted to bring another child into the world only to risk leaving them behind. So I underwent a permanent vasectomy. It was a closed chapter of my medical history. When Paige and I discussed our future 5 years ago, and she swore to me she never wanted children, I saw no reason to disclose the procedure. Why bring up a painful private medical detail when we were already in total agreement about our child-free future? I kept it to myself. It was my secret. Now that very secret was the only thing standing between me and the greatest deception of my life. I held her tighter, fighting every instinct in my body that wanted to push her away and demand the truth. I knew if I confronted her right then, without proof, without a plan, she would spin a web of lies. She would cry, she would deflect, she would find a way to manipulate the narrative. I had spent 40 years negotiating with cutthroat businessmen. I knew that you never show your cards until you have backed your opponent into a corner they cannot escape. I know the doctors told me years ago that my chances of conceiving naturally at my age were practically zero. Paige rambled, pulling back slightly to look at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. But the ocean air in St. Bart's, the utter relaxation, the lack of stress, it must have healed something in me. It must have just happened right before I left for the trip. Tell me you are happy, Douglas. Please tell me you are not angry. Her performance was flawless. If I had not known the absolute medical impossibility of her words, I would have believed every single syllable. The vulnerability in her voice, the hopeful desperation in her eyes, it was a masterclass in manipulation. Angry, I said, forcing the warmest smile I could muster. How could I be angry about a blessing like this? I am overjoyed, Paige. We need to celebrate. I need to process this, but I am so happy. She threw her arms around my neck again, breathing a heavy sigh of relief. I let her cling to me, my mind racing 1,000,000 miles a minute. I needed to control the environment. I needed to isolate the variables. Why do you not go take a warm bath and try to relax? I suggested gently. You are shaking. Let me make some calls and clear my schedule for the rest of the day. We have a lot to talk about. She nodded enthusiastically, wiping her eyes. I am going to call Erica and Monica, she said, referencing the friends she had gone to St. Bart's with. They are not going to believe this. I watched her walk out of my office, closing the heavy oak door behind her. The moment the latch clicked shut, the fake smile dropped from my face. The silence in the room was deafening. I stood alone in my penthouse, looking down at the 2 pink lines on the desk. She was pregnant. That was a fact. But she had been in St. Bart's for 3 weeks with a group of women. There were supposedly no men on that trip, which meant either she had engaged in a reckless affair right here in Chicago before she left, or that luxury girls' trip was a carefully orchestrated cover for something much more sinister. My hands did not shake as I reached for my phone. The grief had already been replaced by a cold, calculating fury. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the private number of my longtime urologist. I hit dial, listening to the ringing tone echo in the quiet office. I did not need to ask him if there was a chance the procedure had reversed itself. I had been tested every few years just for my own peace of mind. I knew the answer. But I needed the medical documentation. I needed the foundation of my counterattack to be carved in stone. When the doctor answered, my voice was perfectly steady. The clueless old man my wife thought she was playing had just left the building. The man who answered the phone was the architect of an empire, and I was about to tear hers to the ground. The phone call with my urologist was brief and entirely professional. Dr. Aris had been my personal physician for over 2 decades. He knew my medical history inside and out. I simply asked him to pull my file from 15 years ago and run a verification on the post-operative tests. He promised to personally check the archives and send me a secure message by the end of the day. I hung up the phone and took a long, deep breath. I needed to compose myself. I needed to transform back into the ecstatic, unsuspecting husband. When I finally walked out of my penthouse office and headed downstairs to the kitchen, the scent of roasted garlic and seared rosemary filled the air. Paige was standing by the marble island wearing a pristine white apron over her elegant clothes. She was humming a soft melody, slicing cherry tomatoes with the precision of a woman who had not a single care in the world. A bottle of expensive, sparkling cider sat chilling in a silver bucket, where her usual red wine would normally be. She looked up and flashed a smile so radiant it could have fooled a polygraph machine. I walked over and kissed her forehead, admiring the elaborate spread she was preparing for us. It was a lavish meal to celebrate our exciting new milestone. We sat down at the long dining table just as the sun began to dip below the Chicago skyline. The golden hour light poured through the large windows, casting a warm glow over the roasted lamb and the crystal glasses. I pulled out her chair for her, playing the part of the perfect gentleman. She sat down gracefully, completely, and utterly unaware that the man standing right behind her already knew she was a liar. Paige reached across the polished table and took my hand in hers. Her skin was warm, her grip tight and reassuring. She started to weave her intricate story, painting a vivid picture of her time in St. Bart's. "Douglas, you have no idea what that trip did for my soul," she murmured, her eyes shining with fake sincerity. "The fresh beach air, the endless ocean views, those incredibly expensive spa treatments you booked for me. It completely washed away all my anxiety and inner tension." She went on and on about the holistic wellness centers they visited, the deep tissue massages, and the daily herbal cleanses. She claimed the luxury resort doctor told her that stress was the leading cause of fertility issues in women her age. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered devotion. "All I needed was to completely unplug from the world," she whispered. "My body just needed to feel totally safe and fully relaxed. That luxurious vacation you gave me was the ultimate key. It miraculously fixed whatever was blocking us from starting a family. I must have conceived right before I left, or maybe the very morning of my departing flight. It is the only logical explanation that makes any real sense." I sat there cutting my lamb with slow, deliberate motions. I nodded along to every single word, matching her emotional tempo perfectly. I told her how incredibly happy I was that the trip had been so intensely restorative. I praised her for taking such excellent care of her personal health. Inside, my mind was dissecting every single syllable she spoke aloud. It was a brilliant, highly plausible lie. It provided a neat romantic explanation for a sudden pregnancy, framing my own financial generosity as the catalyst for our little miracle. I took a sip of my sparkling cider and leaned back in my chair. I wanted to see exactly how far she would take the deception. So I asked about the trip in more detail. I asked about her daily activities on the island, acting like a curious, doting husband who simply wanted to share in her joy. "Did you ladies manage to get any privacy on the beaches down there?" I asked casually, keeping my tone light. "I know those luxury resorts can get crowded this time of year, especially with the yacht crowds." Paige did not miss a single beat. She laughed softly, a light, airy sound that echoed throughout the dining room. "Oh, it was strictly just us girls the entire time," she insisted with confidence. "Erica, Monica, and our tight inner circle. We rented that private villa on the cliffside exactly so we would not have to deal with anyone else. We did not go to any of the crowded public beach clubs or loud tourist spots. We just drank green juice, did peaceful morning yoga on the terrace, and talked about life. Absolutely no men were ever present or allowed near our group. It was a complete and utter sanctuary." I smiled warmly and praised her friends for being such a wonderful support system. "Erica is a truly good woman," I replied smoothly. "Her husband must have missed her terribly while you were all away." Paige nodded vigorously, taking another slow bite of her dinner. "Yes," she said, looking right into my eyes without blinking. "But we all agreed it was incredibly important to just disconnect from our husbands and our routines for a few weeks." I took another sip of my cider, hiding my complete disgust. It was a true masterclass in pure manipulation. The quiet evening progressed completely flawlessly. We finished our meal and moved into the living room. Paige sat on the sofa, resting her hands on her flat stomach, already talking about hiring an interior designer for the new nursery. I sat in my armchair across from her, offering suggestions about color palettes and custom baby furniture. I played my role perfectly, never letting my smile fade for a moment. Then my phone vibrated sharply inside my suit jacket pocket. I pulled it out slowly, keeping my facial expression completely neutral and relaxed. It was a highly secure text message from Dr. Aris. I opened the private message while Paige continued chatting happily about buying expensive baby clothes. The text was brief, highly clinical, and completely devastating to the false reality my wife had built. It read, "Douglas, I reviewed your archived medical files and the subsequent follow-up tests. Your sperm count was absolute 0. It remains a mathematical and biological impossibility for you to father a child naturally." I stared at the glowing phone screen for a long, heavy moment. The ultimate confirmation was final and absolute. There was no margin for error, no statistical anomaly, no miraculous intervention. The child growing inside my wife undoubtedly belonged to another man. I locked my phone screen and slid the device quietly back into my dark pocket. I looked up at Paige again. She was still smiling brightly, still talking excitedly about whether we should buy a summer home in the Hamptons for the baby. My heart was completely hollowed out, but my mind had never been sharper. The woman sitting across from me was not just unfaithful, she was a predator. She had looked me in the eye, eaten the food my money bought, and lied with a sociopathic ease. Over the next 48 hours, my home transformed from a sanctuary into an active surveillance zone. I did not change my daily routine. I woke up at my usual time, drank my black coffee, and kissed my wife on the cheek before heading to my home office. But beneath the surface of my calm demeanor, every single sense I possessed was on high alert. I began to study Paige not as a husband admiring his wife, but as a predator studying its prey. The shifts in her behavior were subtle at first, the kind of tiny details a genuinely happy, unsuspecting man would easily overlook. But I was no longer unsuspecting. I noticed how her cell phone had suddenly become a permanent extension of her physical body. Before her trip to St. Bart's, she used to leave her phone carelessly on the kitchen counter or tossed casually onto the living room sofa. Now it never left her hand. When we sat together watching television in the evening, she kept the screen facing completely downward on her lap. If she went into the kitchen to pour a glass of water, the phone went with her. The most glaring red flag came on Thursday morning. I woke up early and walked into our master bathroom while she was taking a shower. I needed to grab my shaving cream from the vanity. Through the frosted glass of the shower door, I could hear the water running, but I also saw the faint glowing outline of her phone resting on the built-in soap shelf right inside the shower stall. She had actually brought the device into the running water with her, just to ensure I could never have a moment alone with it. I quietly stepped back into the bedroom and walked over to her bedside table where she usually kept her charger. I pressed the home button on her tablet, which was synced to her phone. A prompt appeared asking for a 6-digit passcode. For 5 years, her passcode had been her birth date. I typed it in. The screen flashed red, indicating an incorrect entry. She had changed her security credentials the moment she returned from the island. She was building a digital fortress to protect her secrets. I simply smiled to myself and walked downstairs to read the morning paper. Let her build her little fortress. I was already designing the wrecking ball. By Friday afternoon, the tension in the house escalated with the arrival of my older son, Garrett. Garrett is 45 years old, a highly successful corporate litigator, and 3 years older than his stepmother. From the very first day I introduced Paige to my family, Garrett had made his absolute disdain for her crystal clear. He had pulled me aside at my own engagement party and warned me that she was nothing but a calculated, patient gold digger waiting for me to step into an early grave. For 5 years, I had vehemently defended my wife against my own blood. I had nearly severed all ties with my only son to protect the woman I thought loved me. Now, watching Garrett walk through the grand double doors of my estate, I felt a crushing wave of guilt. He had been right all along. Paige came down the sweeping spiral staircase wearing a flowing maternity dress she had bought just yesterday. She rushed forward with open arms, acting the part of the overjoyed, expectant mother. Garrett did not return the embrace. He stood rigid in the foyer, his sharp eyes scanning her from head to toe. I stepped forward, placing a steady hand on my son's shoulder, and asked him to join us in the formal living room for some tea. We sat on the plush leather sofas, the atmosphere thick with unspoken hostility. Paige poured the tea with hands that trembled slightly, though she tried desperately to hide it beneath a wide, enthusiastic smile. She started launching into the same perfectly rehearsed speech she had given me, talking about the relaxing ocean breeze, the expensive holistic spa treatments in St. Bart's, and the divine miracle of her sudden fertility. Garrett did not buy a single word of it. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, and stared directly into her eyes. He asked her how exactly a woman of 42, who had explicitly claimed to be barren for her entire adult life, suddenly manages to conceive after a 3-week vacation without her husband. His tone was not just skeptical. It was razor-sharp, methodical, and entirely unforgiving. He asked if she had consulted a specialist before the trip. He asked for the exact dates of her fertility window. He cornered her with the precision of a seasoned prosecutor, cross-examining a hostile witness. Paige shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic. She stammered out a defensive reply, claiming that miracles do not require medical explanations, and that Garrett was being incredibly cruel to his father by questioning our blessing. Right at that exact moment, the tension in the room snapped. A soft, barely audible vibration buzzed from the pocket of her maternity dress. I watched carefully as she subtly shifted her weight and pulled the phone out just far enough to glance at the screen. For a fraction of a second, her entire facial expression completely shattered. The mask of the indignant, offended mother vanished. Pure, unfiltered terror flashed across her eyes. It was a look of utter desperation, the kind of look a trapped animal gives right before the cage drops. She shot a panicked, defensive glance toward the phone screen, then immediately shoved the device deep into her pocket and forced a tight, artificial smile back onto her face. Garrett was too busy formulating his next aggressive question to catch that fleeting micro-expression. But I saw it. I saw the fear. I saw the hidden notification lighting up her screen. Whoever had just sent her that message was the puppet master pulling the strings of this entire charade. She excused herself from the living room shortly after, claiming the stress of the conversation was bad for the baby. Garrett turned to me, ready to launch into a tirade about her deception, but I simply raised my hand to silence him. I told him to trust me, that I had everything completely under control, and that he needed to go home and wait for my call. Later that evening, while Paige ran a warm bath, I slipped into her massive walk-in closet. She had still not fully unpacked the expensive designer luggage from her tropical trip. I began sifting through her belongings, looking for a physical clue to tie her to the secret. Near the bottom of the largest suitcase, I found a delicate silk scarf. I pulled the fabric from the luggage. As it moved through the air, a distinct, powerful scent hit my senses. It was an ultra-expensive, custom-blended men's cologne featuring rich notes of aged cedar and imported tobacco. I knew that exact, unmistakable fragrance perfectly well. It belonged to Blake Remington, a wealthy hedge fund manager and the husband of Paige's best friend, Erica. The staggering, brutal truth was finally and completely undeniable. I carefully folded the delicate silk scarf and placed it right back into her designer luggage. I walked out of the massive closet and slipped into the bed, pulling the heavy duvet over my shoulders. I turned off my bedside lamp, plunging the room into deep shadow. A few minutes later, Paige stepped out of the bathroom wrapped in a white robe smelling of lavender lotion. I closed my eyes just enough to feign the deep rhythmic breathing of a man who had completely surrendered to sleep, but I was entirely awake. The master bedroom featured a wall of floor-to-ceiling glass doors that opened onto a private balcony overlooking the city. The ambient light from the Chicago skyline turned those glass panes into a perfect dark mirror. I opened my eyes a fraction of an inch and watched her reflection. Paige stood at the foot of the bed for a long moment, simply staring at my resting form. She was verifying my sleep. When she was completely satisfied, she turned away, picked up her securely locked cell phone from the vanity, and slid the glass balcony door open as quietly as possible. The crisp night air drifted gently into the quiet room. I kept my breathing steady, slow, and even, but I strained my ears to catch every single spoken syllable. She dialed a number and held the phone close to her face, keeping her voice pitched to a frantic, breathless whisper. "Blake," she murmured into the night. "Yes, I am safe. He is fast asleep. Listen to me. You need to calm down. He suspects absolutely nothing. He is already looking at expensive nursery designs and talking about setting up accounts. I promise you, Blake, the plan is working perfectly. Just give me a little more time." I watched her pacing back and forth on the balcony, wrapping her robe tighter around her waist. She sounded desperate, not like a woman drunk on a romantic affair, but like a co-conspirator managing a highly volatile crisis. She whispered a few more reassurances, blew a quiet kiss into the receiver, and ended the call. When she finally slid back into the bed right next to me, sliding her cold feet directly against my warm legs, I did not pull away from her. I lay there in the dark, digesting the sheer magnitude of what I had just witnessed. This was absolutely not a simple, careless crime of passion. She was reporting back to him. They were executing a coordinated strategy. The next morning, I left the house at 7 sharp, claiming I had an urgent breakfast meeting. I drove my car into the heart of downtown Chicago, pulling into the private parking garage of an upscale diner located in the financial district. I walked through the heavy glass doors to a secluded booth in the back corner. Sitting there, quietly, patiently waiting for me in the dim light, was Victor Cole. Victor was an elite private investigator I had retained for over 10 years, primarily to vet corporate acquisitions and handle industrial espionage cases. He was meticulous, completely discreet, and legally ruthless. I slid into the leather booth across from him and ordered a simple black coffee. Victor did not waste any time with pleasantries. He immediately reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder, quickly sliding it across the polished wooden table. I opened the file and began sifting through the highly detailed documents. I expected to find standard proof of infidelity, perhaps hotel receipts or private jet manifests confirming Blake Remington had flown down to St. Bart's. But what I found was far more complex and significantly more alarming. The first page was a highly confidential financial summary regarding Blake Remington and his boutique hedge fund. I looked up at Victor, raising an eyebrow. I asked him to explain exactly what I was looking at. Victor leaned forward, lowering his voice so that only I could hear. "Richard," he said grimly, "Blake Remington is completely bankrupt. He has been running a massive Ponzi scheme for the last 3 years, using new investor capital to cover catastrophic losses in the overseas market. The Securities and Exchange Commission has been quietly building a massive federal fraud case against him for the past 6 months. They are preparing to drop the hammer. Within the next 90 days, the federal government is going to freeze every single one of his domestic and international bank accounts. He is drowning in millions of dollars of toxic debt, and he is facing a very lengthy federal prison sentence." I stared at the financial records, the intricate web of shell companies and failing offshore accounts. The picture was becoming horrifyingly clear. I asked Victor about Blake's wife, Erica, who came from old Chicago money. Surely her family could bail him out. Victor shook his head firmly. "Erica's family money is locked up tightly in a generational ironclad trust," he explained. "Blake cannot legally touch a single penny of her principal wealth. He is entirely cut off from the family fortune, and his own liquid assets are rapidly evaporating. He desperately needs an immediate massive infusion of untraceable cash to pay off his most aggressive creditors and flee the country before the federal indictments are unsealed." I sat back against the leather booth, staring blankly at the cold coffee sitting in front of me. The final piece of the puzzle violently snapped into place. Paige and Blake were not just two arrogant fools who had gotten careless during a tropical vacation. The sudden pregnancy was not an accident born of forbidden passion. It was a highly calculated, incredibly malicious, and surgically planned financial operation. They had deliberately orchestrated this entirely fake miracle. They fully knew my immense personal wealth, and they weaponized my deep, unspoken desire for a lasting legacy. They intended to use this unborn child as an emotional anchor to siphon millions of dollars directly from my personal estate. Once the child was born, they expected me to shower the baby with extravagant trust funds and massive cash reserves. Then Paige would file for a sudden divorce, taking my money and funneling it into Blake's desperate hands to save him from federal ruin. My wife was treating my life's work as a personal bailout fund for her bankrupt lover. I closed the thick dossier and slid it back into my briefcase. The profound sadness I had felt just days ago evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, terrifying, and razor-sharp clarity. I looked at Victor and genuinely thanked him for his outstanding work. I instructed him to immediately double his surveillance operations on both of them. I paid the bill, walked out of the diner, and stepped back out into the bright, bustling downtown streets of Chicago. They wanted to play a high-stakes game with my empire, treating my 4 decades of hard work as nothing more than free casino chips. They truly thought that I was just an easy, vulnerable target. But I was about to teach them exactly why I was the one who owned the entire board. I was going to completely and systematically destroy them both, tearing their lives apart piece by piece. The revelation hit me not with anger, but with terrifying stillness. I walked the streets of downtown Chicago, surrounded by traffic, yet feeling entirely isolated. Most men would have rushed home, kicked the door open, and confronted their deceitful wife. They would have thrown the dossiers on the counter, screamed, and demanded immediate answers. I understood that impulse. The desire for immediate vindication is a powerful drug. But reacting with raw emotion is exactly what amateurs do. I had not spent 40 years building a commercial real estate empire by throwing temper tantrums. I built my fortune by anticipating my opponents' moves and dismantling their infrastructure so thoroughly they could never rebuild. Paige and Blake wanted to use my legacy as a life raft for their sinking ship. They treated my entire existence as a mere stepping stone for their own survival. Therefore, simply divorcing Paige was no longer sufficient. I did not just want to end a marriage. I wanted total systemic destruction of their lives. I wanted them to feel the exact same cold panic they planned for me. To achieve absolute ruin, I needed undeniable, admissible proof of their conspiracy. The financial records Victor Cole had handed me were a fantastic start, but they only established the motive. I needed their actual voices. I needed to capture their explicit intent to defraud me. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Victor back. He answered on the second ring, his tone sharp and professional. I told him that passive surveillance was no longer going to cut it. I needed to know exactly what Paige and Blake were saying to each other when they thought they were completely safe. Victor understood my directive immediately. He suggested planting a state-of-the-art, voice-activated recording device directly inside Paige's custom white Range Rover. It was the perfect environment for an interception. The car was her private sanctuary, the place where she made her most sensitive phone calls while driving across the city. Victor explained the logistics. He had a team of specialists who could bypass the vehicle security system without triggering alarms or leaving a trace of entry. I gave him the green light. That very night, while Paige slept in our master bedroom, dreaming of stolen millions, Victor's team approached my estate. Under the cover of profound darkness, they seamlessly unlocked the Range Rover and secured a tiny, highly advanced microphone deep beneath the passenger seat. The device was wired directly into the auxiliary power supply, ensuring it would never run out of battery. It would automatically begin recording the second the engine turned on, and would transmit encrypted audio files directly to a secure cloud server that only Victor and I could access. The digital trap was officially set. Now I just needed to give my beautiful wife a compelling reason to jump right into the center of it. The following evening, I arrived home from the office with a lavish bouquet of her favorite white lilies. I played the role of the ecstatic father to be with Oscar, winning precision. I found Paige lounging on the back patio, sipping sparkling water and browsing through a catalog of luxury baby strollers. I handed her the flowers, kissed her cheek, and sat down in the wicker chair opposite hers. The warm evening summer breeze gently blew through the beautiful garden, creating a picturesque, peaceful scene that masked the cold venom running through my veins. I looked at her with a gentle, loving smile. "Sweetheart." I began keeping my voice steady and thick with fake emotion. "I have been doing a lot of thinking today about our future. This baby has completely shifted my perspective on what truly matters in this life." Paige set her catalog down on the glass table, her eyes widening with perfectly performed innocence. "What do you mean, Douglas?" she asked softly, reaching across the table to gently caress my hand. I squeezed her fingers affectionately. "I mean that I want to ensure this child never has to worry about a single thing. I want to build an absolute fortress around our new family." I spent my morning meeting with my senior wealth management team. I instructed them to begin the preliminary paperwork to establish a massive multi-million-dollar inheritance fund specifically dedicated to the baby. I am talking about an irrevocable trust that will hold a significant portion of my liquid assets. I want this child to have a financial safety net that no one, not even my older son Garrett, can ever touch or contest. I want our little miracle to be the primary heir to everything I have built. I watched her face with the intense scrutiny of a hawk. She tried her absolute best to maintain her sweet maternal composure, but the sheer magnitude of the bait I had just dropped was too massive for her to process cleanly. I saw the muscles in her slender neck tighten as she swallowed hard. A subtle, involuntary tremor moved through her hand before she quickly withdrew it from mine, pretending to adjust the collar of her silk blouse. The greed in her eyes flared up like a raging bonfire, burning so brightly it almost consumed her entirely. This was exactly what she and Blake had been plotting to achieve, and I was handing it to them on a silver platter far sooner than they had ever anticipated. "Oh, Douglas," she breathed, her voice shaking with genuine adrenaline. "That is so incredibly generous. That is so thoughtful of you. I do not even know what to say. You are going to be the most wonderful father in the world." She quickly stood up from her chair and walked around the table to embrace me. As she wrapped her arms around my shoulders, pressing her face against my neck, I kept my eyes completely open. I looked past her shoulder and watched her right hand slip stealthily into the deep pocket of her designer cardigan. Beneath the absolute cover of our embrace, her fingers were moving rapidly against the glowing screen of her hidden cell phone. She was typing blindly, sending a frantic, desperate text message right under my nose. I knew who she was contacting. I knew exactly what she was telling him. She was alerting Blake Remington that the golden goose was finally ready for the slaughter, that the multi-million-dollar prize they needed to save him from federal prison was officially within their grasp. I patted her back gently, offering soft murmurs of affection, while a cold, triumphant satisfaction washed over my entire soul. The illusion was flawless. By feeding her the exact financial information she craved, I had intentionally spiked her adrenaline and urgency. I knew that greedy, desperate people inevitably make sloppy, reckless mistakes when they believe the finish line is right in front of them. Paige thought she was expertly manipulating an old, vulnerable man. She had no idea she was dancing blindly into a carefully constructed cage. All I had to do now was sit back in the shadows and wait for the hidden microphone inside her pristine white Range Rover to capture her complete destruction. The very next morning, Paige woke up with a renewed, almost manic energy. She spent nearly an hour in front of her vanity mirror, meticulously applying a fresh layer of flawless makeup and arranging her hair into a seemingly effortless, casual style. She selected a brand new set of expensive designer athletic wear, ensuring the fabric hugged her waist just enough to emphasize her fragile state. When she finally glided into the kitchen to pour herself a glass of lemon water, her performance was dialed up to absolute perfection. She leaned against the marble island, offering me a soft, radiant smile as I sipped my morning coffee. "Douglas, darling," she murmured, taking a delicate sip from her glass. "I am going to head out soon. I managed to book a private session at that exclusive prenatal yoga studio on the north side of Chicago. The instructor comes highly recommended by Erica, and she specializes in helping older mothers maintain core tranquility during the first trimester. I think it will be incredibly good for the baby, especially after all the overwhelming excitement from last night." I looked at her over the rim of my coffee mug, maintaining my warm, supportive facade. "That sounds like a wonderful idea, sweetheart," I replied smoothly. "You need to focus entirely on your physical wellness right now. Take all the time you need, and please, do not rush back on my account. I will be tied up with financial conference calls in my office for most of the afternoon anyway." She walked over, pressed a lingering, affectionate kiss against my cheek, and grabbed her car keys from the counter. I watched her walk out to the garage, listening to the heavy thud of the door closing behind her. The moment I heard the distinct, powerful engine of her white Range Rover roar to life, I left the kitchen and walked directly upstairs to my penthouse office. I locked the heavy oak door behind me and walked over to my desk. I opened a secure, encrypted application on my primary computer monitor. A detailed, high-resolution satellite map of the greater Chicago area immediately materialized on the screen. A small, pulsing red dot represented my wife's vehicle. I sat back in my leather chair, steepling my fingers, and watched the digital marker begin to move slowly through the morning traffic. For the first 20 minutes, she drove straight north, following the exact route she would naturally take to reach the upscale yoga studio she had mentioned. But as the pulsing red dot approached the final intersection before the fitness center, it did not slow down. It did not turn into the parking garage. Instead, the red dot accelerated, completely bypassing the yoga studio and merging directly onto the lakeside highway. She drove with determined speed, heading toward a highly secluded, notoriously expensive boutique hotel nestled quietly along the pristine shores of Lake Michigan. It was a discreet establishment, famous among the ultra-wealthy for its private, obscured entrances and strict policies regarding guest anonymity. I watched her digital marker finally come to a complete halt right in the hotel's underground parking facility. The trap was now fully operational. I picked up my secure secondary cell phone and sent a single blank text message to Victor Cole. Less than 2 minutes later, my phone buzzed with an incoming encrypted file. Victor was already firmly established on the hotel premises, having positioned himself in a highly advantageous, concealed vantage point near the private rear entrance. I opened the digital file and found a continuous stream of high-definition time-stamped photographs. The first image clearly showed Paige stepping out of her Range Rover, nervously adjusting her designer sunglasses and glancing over her shoulder before slipping into the private elevator bank. The next sequence of photographs sent a fresh wave of cold, calculating clarity washing over me. A sleek, black luxury sedan pulled into the exact same discreet parking structure just 10 minutes after my wife arrived. The driver stepped out, and Victor's long-range camera lens captured his face with absolute, undeniable precision. It was Blake Remington. He was wearing a dark, tailored suit, looking incredibly tense and excessively cautious. He carried a heavy leather briefcase likely filled with the fraudulent financial documents he was desperately trying to salvage. Another text message from Victor popped onto my screen, delivering a concise, devastating update. The message confirmed that Blake had bypassed the main reception desk entirely. He had previously checked into a secluded luxury suite under a completely fabricated corporate alias, using a shell company credit card to ensure the transaction could never be directly traced back to his personal banking records. He was moving like a cornered fugitive, desperately trying to finalize his catastrophic exit strategy. I sat in the profound silence of my penthouse office, looking out at the sweeping, majestic view of the Chicago skyline. I had spent 40 relentless years building an unshakable empire in this city. I had laid the foundation of my legacy with sweat, sacrifice, and unwavering discipline. Now a bankrupt coward and a greedy, manipulative woman were actively conspiring to tear that legacy to the ground, treating my life's work as a convenient solution to their own miserable failures. They were currently sitting together in a heavily guarded, luxurious hotel suite, believing they were the smartest people in the entire world. They undoubtedly thought their brilliant scheme was unfolding exactly as they had designed it. They were entirely convinced that I was just a blind, trusting old fool eagerly waiting at home to shower them with my hard-earned millions. But they were fundamentally wrong. I did not feel any lingering sorrow. I did not feel any sudden urges to storm the hotel, kick down the heavy wooden door to their suite, and demand a pathetic, tearful confession. I possessed far too much self-respect to engage in a vulgar, emotional confrontation. I simply remained in my leather chair, entirely still, perfectly calm, and completely focused. I turned my attention back to my primary computer monitor, navigating to the secure cloud server linked directly to the hidden microphone planted deep beneath the passenger seat of the Range Rover. The digital interface showed that the connection was completely stable. The recording device was armed, completely silent, and waiting in the dark. In just a few short hours, Paige would eventually leave her bankrupt lover. She would walk back to her vehicle, settle into the driver's seat, and pick up her cell phone to make her final strategic updates. I just had to be patient. I leaned back, poured myself a glass of cold water, and waited for the audio recording to catch their actual conversation, knowing it would be the exact weapon I needed to completely bury them both and secure my entire legacy. I sat still. The game was entirely mine. My plan was flawlessly in motion. I could afford to wait. Every single minute brought them closer to ruin. I took a long, slow breath, watching the digital monitor blink silently, ensuring that my impending victory would be absolutely flawless and undeniably absolute, cementing my future firmly. It was perfect. The hours dragged on with agonizing slowness as I sat in the profound darkness of my penthouse study. I kept the room entirely unlit, save for the cool, pale glow emitting from my computer monitor. Outside my window, the sprawling Chicago skyline glittered with thousands of tiny lights, indifferent to the devastating betrayal unfolding just a few miles north along the lake. I stared at the digital interface connected to the hidden recording device planted beneath the passenger seat of Paige's custom white Range Rover. The software remained inactive, a silent testament to the hours my wife was currently spending in a secluded hotel suite with her bankrupt lover. I did not pace. I did not pour myself a drink. I simply sat perfectly still, my hands folded on my mahogany desk, breathing in slow, measured increments. I was mentally preparing myself for what was about to come. I knew that hearing the betrayal spoken aloud, hearing the malice in their voices, would be an entirely different experience from merely reading cold financial documents. At exactly 11 o'clock that night, the digital monitor finally blinked to life. A small green icon flared on the screen, indicating that the vehicle's engine had just been ignited. A few seconds later, an encrypted audio file began downloading directly onto my secure local server. I rested my finger over the mouse, taking one final deep breath to brace my mind for the impact. Then I clicked play. The recording began with the sharp, distinct sound of heavy car doors slamming shut, followed immediately by the low, muffled hum of the luxury engine turning over. The acoustics were incredibly clear. For a brief moment, there was only the sound of a deep, lingering kiss, a sickening noise that made the muscles in my jaw tighten involuntarily. Then Blake Remington spoke. His voice was laced with a thick, arrogant superiority completely devoid of any guilt or hesitation. "The old fool actually bought it?" he asked, letting out a short, mocking laugh that echoed through my quiet study. "Did he really buy the whole Miracle Act?" Paige's voice answered immediately, and the sheer enthusiasm in her tone made my blood run absolute ice. "Completely," she replied, her words dripping with condescending amusement. "He practically cried, Blake. It was almost too easy. He is already planning to leave the entire commercial estate to the baby. He has absolutely no idea what is actually happening. He is totally eating out of the palm of my hand right now today." I slowly paused the recording for a fraction of a second, letting the sheer toxicity of her words settle into the silent room. The young woman I had fed, clothed, and protected for 5 years viewed me as nothing more than a pathetic, gullible stepping stone. I pressed play again, forcing myself to listen to every single agonizing detail of their master plan. The conversation shifted quickly from arrogant boasting to cold, calculated logistics. Blake suddenly sounded incredibly tense as he began outlining his catastrophic legal situation. He explained that his defense attorneys had just received a confidential warning from their contacts within the federal government. The strict Securities and Exchange Commission was moving much faster than they had originally anticipated. The federal prosecutors were preparing to unseal the criminal indictments within a mere matter of short weeks, and the moment they did, every single financial asset tied to his name would be immediately and permanently frozen. He explicitly told Page that if he did not somehow secure a massive infusion of clean, untraceable liquidity before the indictments dropped, he would undoubtedly spend the rest of his natural life rotting inside a cold, unforgiving federal penitentiary for his extensive crimes. "We need that $30 million, Page Blake stated, his voice tight with growing desperation. "We need it secured, and we need it completely shielded from any federal oversight. That is exactly why this baby is the perfect anchor. You have to push him to establish the irrevocable trust fund as soon as humanly possible." Page responded with a cold, terrifying level of strategic precision. "Do not worry about the timeline," she reassured him smoothly. "He is so desperate for a legacy that he is moving forward with the wealth management team this very week. Once he publicly claims this child and legally transfers the $30 million into the trust fund, I will ensure that I am named as the sole managing trustee. As soon as the ink dries and the funds are fully cleared, I will file for an immediate surprise divorce. I will claim emotional distress. I will take the trust money, and we will funnel it directly through those offshore shell companies you set up in the Caymans. They will never be able to trace the capital back to you, and Douglas will be far too humiliated by the sudden public scandal to fight back effectively." The sheer, unadulterated brilliance of their absolute, undeniable malice was truly staggering to fully comprehend. They had deliberately weaponized the state legal system and my own heavily anticipated personal generosity to build an impenetrable financial shield for themselves. By cunningly utilizing an irrevocable trust account, the money would legally belong to the unborn child, making it nearly completely impossible for me to reclaim the funds once the initial bank transfer was fully finalized. With Page positioned as the sole legal trustee, she would ultimately have absolute unchecked and unmonitored administrative authority to drain the accounts under the guise of providing for the child's future well-being. They literally planned to use my own hard-earned fortune to bail a white-collar criminal out of a federal disaster while leaving me publicly broken, financially drained, and emotionally devastated. Blake actually laughed again in the dark car, a sound so incredibly vile it made my bare hands curl into extremely tight fists. The best part is that he will definitely be far too embarrassed to demand a paternity test once he has paraded his little miracle around to all his wealthy corporate friends, he gloated. We have him backed into a perfect corner. I reached out and turned off the audio player. Any lingering trace of sorrow or any pathetic fraction of my heart that still wanted to believe there was a misunderstanding was eradicated. My wife was not just a cheating spouse. She was the architect of an active, highly sophisticated financial heist. They genuinely believed that I was a weak target. They assumed my age made me slow and that my desire for a family made me blind to their treachery. But they had profoundly miscalculated. I had navigated the treacherous waters of commercial real estate for 40 years. I had crushed ruthless competitors and dismantled hostile takeovers long before Page had even graduated high school. I slowly stood up from my mahogany desk and confidently walked over to the expansive glass windows looking out over the city. I simply needed my lead corporate attorney today. If they wanted to play a game involving legal trusts and complex financial loopholes, I was going to give them exactly what they asked for, but with a fatal twist they would never see coming. I reached out towards the glowing computer screen and clicked the play button once more. A sudden urge compelled me to listen to the remainder of their intercepted conversation. I needed to understand the absolute depth of the darkness I was dealing with. The sound of their voices filled my quiet office again. What I heard next was so profoundly cruel that it stripped away any remaining shred of humanity I thought my wife possessed. Paige and Blake were not just celebrating their impending payday. They were actively congratulating themselves on the precise timing of the child's conception. Blake spoke with a sickening pride. He explained how they had studied my business travel schedule and matched it perfectly with her trip to St. Bart's. They had meticulously calculated her ovulation cycle months in advance. Paige laughed softly, her voice echoing through the hidden microphone. She told him that getting pregnant during the tropical vacation was the ultimate insurance policy. They knew that if she came back from a luxurious, relaxing trip carrying a child, my wealth and my desperate desire for a family would automatically shield the baby from any initial suspicion. They had bred an innocent child for the sole purpose of using it as a financial weapon against me. But the absolute worst part was yet to come. Blake shifted his tone from arrogant to highly strategic. He began discussing my public corporate standing. He knew that my real estate empire was publicly traded and heavily reliant on my personal reputation. He explained to Paige that my image as a devoted, respectable family man was the primary cornerstone of my company's stock value. If I ever started to suspect the child was not mine, Blake had a contingency plan already mapped out. He told her that if I tried to fight the paternity or demand a divorce without giving them the money, they would drag my name through the most vicious public legal battle in Chicago history. Blake's voice sounded cold and utterly ruthless. He said they would leak fabricated stories to the press. They would paint me as a paranoid, abusive old man trying to abandon his young wife and his innocent miracle child. He told Paige that the ensuing media circus would send my corporate stock plummeting into the ground. He bragged that my loyal board of directors would totally panic and force me to settle quietly, just to save the company portfolio. They were not just planning to steal my money. They were actively planning to hold my entire life's work hostage. They believed they could force me into a corner where I would have absolutely no choice but to surrender my fortune just to protect my business empire. The recording eventually clicked off as the car engine shut down. The digital monitor went dark. I sat in my leather chair and stared at the blank screen for a very long time. An ordinary man might have broken down right then and there. A weaker man might have poured another glass of bourbon, cried for his ruined marriage, or felt overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the impending public humiliation. But I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel any fear. Instead, I felt a deep, profound sense of focus. They wanted to use my corporate reputation against me. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial chess. They had completely forgotten that I was the one who wrote the rules to that exact game. I stood up from my mahogany desk. I meticulously gathered the audio files, the satellite tracking logs, and the thick dossier of financial ruin that Victor had compiled. I placed every single piece of evidence into a secure leather briefcase. I locked my office door and walked downstairs. I managed to sleep for 3 solid hours that night, my mind functioning with the cold efficiency of a machine. When the morning sun finally rose over the Chicago skyline, I did not stay home to drink coffee with my treacherous wife. I left the penthouse before she even woke up. I had a very important appointment. I drove directly to the sleek, towering glass building that housed my corporate legal team. I walked past the reception desk and went straight into the corner office of Langdon Cross. Langdon was my elite corporate attorney. He had been by my side for over 20 years. He was a brilliant, ruthless legal mind who specialized in dismantling hostile corporate takeovers and crushing aggressive litigation. When I walked into his office, he took one look at my face and immediately closed his laptop. He told his secretary to hold all his calls for the rest of the morning. I sat down across from him and opened my leather briefcase. I did not waste time with emotional introductions. I placed the financial reports outlining Blake's impending federal bankruptcy directly on his desk. Next, I handed him the high-definition photographs of Paige and Blake meeting at the secluded boutique hotel. Finally, I handed him a secure digital drive containing the audio recordings from the vehicle. I looked him in the eye and told him to listen to the files. I sat there in total silence as Langdon plugged the drive into his secure computer and pressed play. I watched my lawyer's expression transform as he listened to the entire conversation. I watched his eyes narrow as Blake detailed the plan to tank my corporate stock and extort $30 million from my personal estate. Langdon was a man who rarely showed emotion, but I could see the cold fury tightening his jaw. When the audio file finally ended, Langdon removed his reading glasses and let out a long, heavy sigh. He looked at the photographs again, then looked up at me. He asked me how I wanted to handle the situation. He told me we could go to the authorities immediately with the fraud evidence, or we could quietly serve her with divorce papers and fight the paternity in a sealed family court. I shook my head slowly. I told Langdon that a quiet divorce was entirely out of the question. I told him that Page and Blake had conspired to use a child as a financial weapon. They had intended to publicly humiliate me and hold my empire hostage. I wanted them to believe their plan was working perfectly. I wanted them to walk right up to the finish line, completely convinced they had won, only to have the ground open up and swallow them whole. I told Langdon about Page's desperate demand for an irrevocable trust fund. I explained that she wanted me to lock $30 million away for the baby, with her acting as the sole managing trustee. Langdon leaned back in his expensive chair. A slow, calculated smile spread across his face. It was the exact grim smile he wore right before he completely destroyed a rival corporation in the courtroom. He tapped his pen against the wooden desk, his brilliant mind already racing through the complex legal architecture of my proposed counterattack. They want a trust fund, Douglas. Let us build them an unforgettable one. Langdon leaned forward across his massive mahogany desk and folded his hands together. He looked at me with a sharp intensity that had made him the most feared corporate attorney in Chicago. We spent 3 hours mapping the exact legal architecture of the trap we would build for my treacherous wife and her bankrupt lover. Langdon explained that to make the deception flawless, we had to give Page exactly what she asked for. We needed to create a legitimate, legally binding, irrevocable family trust agreement. It had to look perfectly standard on the surface. It had to possess all the proper legal seals, standard tax exemption clauses, and complex financial jargon that would make any amateur reader simply glaze over the pages. Langdon called in his top 2 estate planning associates and swore them to absolute secrecy. They immediately began drafting an incredibly dense 80-page document establishing a $30 million fund for my unborn child. I sat in the corner of the office drinking black coffee and watching the brilliant legal minds work. They constructed a financial vehicle so massive and imposing that Page would be completely blinded by the sheer volume of the wealth it represented. She would see the zeros and lose any sense of caution. The true genius of Langdon Cross was not in the construction of the wealth. It was in the microscopic details of the conditions. As the massive document took shape, Langdon asked the associates to leave the room. He turned his computer monitor toward me and pointed to a specific paragraph buried deep within the convoluted text. It was located on page 47, deliberately sandwiched between incredibly boring stipulations regarding international tax liabilities and corporate dividend schedules. Anyone reading the document would naturally skip right over it in their rush to get to the signature line. Langdon read the clause aloud to me. It stated in ironclad legal terms that the $30 million trust fund would only activate if the primary grantor, being myself, was definitively verified as the biological father of the child. The clause explicitly mandated that this verification had to be conducted through a court-admissible independent DNA paternity test administered immediately upon the birth of the child. If the biological match was not an absolute certainty, the trust would be rendered immediately null and void. The funds would instantly revert back to my primary corporate holding accounts, and the designated managing trustee, which was Page, would be permanently stripped of all administrative rights and claims. It was a perfect, inescapable legal trap. Paige would sign the document thinking she was securing her stolen fortune, completely unaware she was legally binding herself to a biological requirement she could never possibly fulfill. Langdon was not finished. He told me that simply denying her the $30 million was not enough to guarantee my total protection. He reminded me that we were still legally married. If the trust fund collapsed, Paige could still attempt to file for a highly contested divorce and lay claim to half of my current marital assets, my properties, and my liquid accounts. We needed to completely sever her access to my existing wealth before the gender reveal party ever took place. To accomplish this, Langdon drafted a second document. It was a comprehensive, ruthlessly thorough post-nuptial asset separation agreement. By signing this document, Paige would voluntarily waive any and all rights to spousal alimony. She would surrender all claims to my real estate portfolio, my domestic and international bank accounts, and my shares in the commercial real estate empire I had spent 40 years building. It was a document designed to leave her with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back in the event of a marital dissolution. I looked at the severe legal paperwork and asked Langdon how we could possibly convince a greedy, calculating woman to voluntarily sign away her ultimate safety net. Langdon smiled his cold, predatory smile and told me greed is always its own worst enemy. We simply had to use her own hubris against her. We had to make her believe signing the post-nuptial agreement was the only way to unlock the $30 million prize she desperately wanted. We needed a believable scapegoat, a plausible threat that would make Paige anxious enough to sign the documents without consulting her own legal counsel. I knew exactly who to use. My older son, Garrett. Garrett had always hated Paige, and she knew he was highly protective of my fortune. I used that family tension to blind her completely. I left the law firm late that afternoon holding 2 leather binders containing our crafted legal weapons. When I arrived back at my penthouse, Paige was sitting on the velvet sofa, browsing through high-end maternity wear on her tablet. I walked over and sat down heavily beside her, letting out a long, exhausted sigh to play the part of a stressed father. I placed the 2 thick leather binders on the glass coffee table. I told her I had spent the entire day fighting with my wealth management team and corporate lawyers. I explained that I successfully ordered the creation of a $30 million irrevocable trust for our child, with her named as the primary managing trustee. Her eyes lit up with overwhelming, greedy excitement. She reached for the binder, but I placed my hand gently over the cover, maintaining a serious, troubled expression. I told her we had a significant problem. I lied smoothly, telling her that my son Garrett caught wind of the massive trust fund and was absolutely furious. I told her Garrett was threatening to legally contest the baby's inheritance, claiming the massive transfer of wealth would inappropriately drain my marital assets. Paige looked alarmed, her manicured hands tightening into fists. She asked what we were going to do, her voice trembling with fear of losing her stolen millions. I looked her directly in the eyes and delivered the final fatal blow of my deception. I told her my lawyers had devised a foolproof defensive strategy to protect our little miracle. I explained that to isolate the $30 million trust fund and shield it from interference by Garrett, we needed to separate our current marital assets. I presented the post-nuptial agreement as a mere bureaucratic formality, a standard legal requirement designed solely to block my jealous son from touching the baby's money. I told her by signing the asset separation agreement, she would prove to the courts the $30 million was an independent entity, making it completely untouchable by anyone else. She was entirely fixated on the enormous sum of $30 million. She weighed the imaginary threat of my son against the massive fortune sitting right in front of her. She did not ask to have her attorney review the paperwork. She did not want to delay the process and risk losing the money. She simply wanted to secure the funds so she and Blake could execute their getaway. Without a single second of hesitation, she reached for the heavy gold pen, opened the thick post-nuptial agreement, and quickly signed her full name on the dotted line. The next morning arrived with a clear, crisp Chicago sunrise that flooded our penthouse kitchen today. I stood by the marble island early that morning, carefully preparing a fresh breakfast for my wife. I brewed her favorite herbal tea arranged a plate of organic fruits, and placed the two heavy leather binders containing our legal traps right next to her teacup. Before she came downstairs, I took a moment to stand in front of the window, looking at my reflection in the dark glass. I practiced my expression. I needed to look fragile. I needed to project the image of a vulnerable, deeply anxious 70-year-old man who was completely overwhelmed by family conflict and utterly desperate to hold on to his beautiful young wife. In the past, my commercial real estate deals were won through unyielding strength and calculated aggression. But this specific battle, the fight to protect my entire life's work from a pair of highly sophisticated parasites, required the absolute perfection of weakness. I needed to make Paige believe that she held all the power, that my aging mind was slowing down, and that my deep affection for our unborn child had completely blinded me to reality. When I heard her elegant footsteps approaching from the hallway, I dropped my shoulders, tilted my head slightly downward, and let a heavy artificial weariness settle over my entire face. Paige glided into the sunlit kitchen, wearing a soft cream-colored silk dress that flowed gracefully over her frame. She looked radiant, radiating the serene air of a completely content, expectant mother. "Good morning, darling," she murmured softly, walking over to press a gentle kiss against my cheek. I noticed her eyes instantly darted to the table, zeroing in on the two thick leather binders sitting beside her plate. Her breathing caught for a fraction of a second, her pupils dilating with immediate greedy anticipation, before she quickly forced her eyes back to me. I pulled out her chair today, with slow, slightly uncoordinated motions, purposely exaggerating a faint tremor in my right hand as I handed her the warm teacup. "Did you manage to get some rest last night, sweetheart?" I asked, keeping my voice pitched to a quiet, weary register. "I am sorry if I was restless. I spent the entire night lying awake thinking about the terrible threats Garrett made. I am just so terrified of my own family turning against us. I do not want our little miracle to grow up surrounded by legal battles and deep financial resentment from his older brother." Paige took a slow sip of her herbal tea, her face softening into an expression of profound maternal sympathy. "Oh, Douglas, you must not let Garrett get into your head like this," she cooed, reaching across the table to gently squeeze my hand. Her skin felt incredibly warm, her touch reassuring, but all I could think about was the audio recording of her cold voice calling me a clueless old man just hours prior. "Garrett is just jealous of our happiness," she continued smoothly. "He cannot stand the fact that we are starting a beautiful new chapter together. We are a family now, Douglas. You and me and this baby. We have to stand completely united against anyone who tries to threaten our future." I nodded my head submissively, letting out a long, theatrical sigh that seemed to carry the full weight of my 70 years. "You are entirely right, Paige," I said, my voice cracking slightly with fake emotion. "That is exactly why I spent the early morning hours finalizing these protection documents today." I slowly pushed the first heavy leather binder toward her. "This is the official Child Trust Fund agreement," I explained softly, pointing to the grand gold embossed cover page. As I watched her, she completely stopped breathing. Her eyes locked onto the massive bold text printed across the front page, which clearly stated the sum of $30 million. It was an astronomical amount of clean liquid capital, far more than she and Blake Remington had ever hoped to extract from me so quickly. I watched her swallow hard, her manicured fingers twitching with an uncontrollable, desperate urgency to flip the pages. I kept my hand resting gently on top of the binder, deliberately blocking her progress. I told her that my lawyers were fully prepared to wire the $30 million into the account by Friday afternoon, but that they insisted on a strict condition to shield the money from Garrett. I moved my hand and pushed the second binder toward her. "This is the comprehensive post-nuptial asset separation agreement," I said, letting a tone of deep vulnerability fill my voice. "My legal planners swear this is the only way to build an ironclad wall around the baby's fund." I leaned back in my chair, looking down to hide the cold, predatory calculation in my eyes. I told her that by signing the asset separation agreement, she would prove to the courts that the $30 million trust fund was an entirely independent entity today. I framed the severe paperwork as a mere bureaucratic weapon, a brilliant shield designed solely to crush my son Garrett's ability to contest the child's future wealth. Paige was completely blinded by the giant $30 million figure staring back at her from the trust cover. Her mind was entirely consumed by the desperate necessity of securing that money to bail Blake out of his federal investigation before the government could freeze his assets. She was so intoxicated by the illusion of her victory that she completely lost any lingering sense of caution. She did not ask to delay the signing. She did not state that she wanted to send the heavy binders to her personal independent attorney for a detailed legal audit. She genuinely believed she was dealing with a frail old husband who was willingly surrendering his empire out of fear. "I do not need a lawyer to look over this," Douglas, Paige said quickly, her voice tight with intense adrenaline. "We do not have time for corporate delays if Garrett is actively planning to freeze our accounts. I trust you completely, and I trust your legal team." She reached out and grabbed my heavy gold pen from the counter today. Without a single second of hesitation, she flipped open the thick post-nuptial document directly to the final signature page and rapidly signed her full legal name on the dotted line. By signing that single document, she had completely and unconditionally signed away her entire future. She had legally waived any and all rights to spousal alimony. She had permanently surrendered any future claim to my private domestic bank accounts, my international investment funds, my luxury properties across the country, and the multi-million-dollar real estate empire I had spent 4 decades building from the ground up. She thought she was trading those rights for an inescapable $30 million trust fund. She had absolutely no idea that page 47 of that trust document required an independent DNA paternity test to activate the money, meaning the trap had officially and completely shut with absolute permanent finality. The moment the dark ink dried on that thick parchment, the atmosphere in our penthouse shifted entirely. Paige closed the leather binder with a sharp, satisfied snap and pushed it gently across the marble island toward me. She let out a long, theatrical breath, playing the part of a relieved, exhausted mother who had just secured her family against an imaginary threat. I took the heavy document, offering her a warm, reassuring nod. Inside, a profound sense of absolute victory settled over my mind. The most difficult phase of my counterattack was complete. She had willingly placed her head inside the guillotine. Now I just needed her to pull the lever herself. Her newfound confidence blossomed immediately. Emboldened by her perceived financial triumph, Paige wasted absolutely no time setting the next phase of her master plan into motion. The very next afternoon, she walked into my home office holding a sleek silver tablet. She sat on the edge of my mahogany desk, crossing her legs elegantly, and presented her grand idea. She told me that our little miracle deserved to be celebrated with the utmost prestige. She demanded we host a massive, high-profile gender reveal gala at our primary estate in Winnetka. She insisted it had to be the social event of the season, a spectacular gathering that would publicly cement my absolute devotion to our growing family. I listened carefully as she outlined her extravagant vision. She wanted to invite 150 of the most elite members of Chicago society. She specifically requested that I invite my entire corporate board of directors, my senior managing partners, and all of my prominent business associates. Her strategy was brilliantly wicked. She wanted to parade my supposed biological child in front of my professional peers, using my own corporate standing to validate her deception. By making the celebration as public and highly visible as possible, she believed she was locking me into a psychological prison. She thought that if I ever discovered the truth later, the sheer public embarrassment of retracting my paternity in front of the city elite would force me to surrender quietly. I smiled warmly and agreed to every single one of her lavish demands. I told her that nothing was too good for the mother of my child. I watched her eyes sparkle with triumph as she finalized the exclusive guest list. She casually mentioned that we simply had to invite her best friend, Erica, and Erica's husband, Blake Remington, positioning them as the esteemed guests of honor. The sheer audacity of inviting her secret lover to celebrate his own biological child using my money was staggering. Yet I did not flinch. I nodded enthusiastically, telling her that Blake and Erica were wonderful people who absolutely deserved front-row seats to our joyous revelation. To maintain the flawless illusion of a completely, utterly oblivious husband, I immediately opened my personal checkbook. I financed the entire gala without asking a single question or raising a single financial objection. I authorized a staggering budget of $150,000 for the single evening. I hired the most elite, highly sought-after catering company in the metropolitan area. I approved the installation of towering, custom-carved ice sculptures and massive floral arrangements, consisting of thousands of rare orchids imported directly from South America. I even encouraged her to hire a professional media team, complete with roaming videographers and high-definition drone cameras, to capture every single moment of the grand celebration. I wanted the cameras rolling. I wanted every single eye in the city fixed directly upon us. I wanted a permanent, undeniable record of exactly what was about to unfold. While Paige spent the next 2 weeks obsessively coordinating with high-end event planners and selecting her designer maternity gown, I was busy executing the final fatal logistical maneuvers of my operation. My days were spent not in blissful anticipation, but in cold, ruthless coordination. As soon as the post-nuptial agreement was legally filed and securely processed by the state courts, I quietly contacted the senior directors of my primary banking institutions. I instructed them to prepare a total lockdown protocol for all my personal and corporate accounts. I established a direct line with my security chief, ensuring that the moment I gave the signal, Paige would be instantly locked out of every single financial vehicle she had previously enjoyed access to. But securing my money was only half the battle. I needed to ensure that Blake Remington's destruction was equally swift and completely inescapable. I reached back out to my private investigator, Victor Cole, and asked him to leverage his high-level contacts within the federal government. Victor managed to secure a highly confidential meeting between my legal team and the specific lead investigator for the Securities and Exchange Commission, who was actively managing Blake's massive fraud case. The federal agents had been meticulously building their securities fraud indictment for months, waiting for the perfect moment to drop the hammer and freeze his remaining liquid assets. My attorney, Langdon Cross, met with the federal investigators in a secure boardroom. He did not disclose the personal, humiliating details of my wife's infidelity. He simply provided them with the exact time, date, and location where Blake Remington would be standing, completely out in the open, entirely distracted, and surrounded by his wealthy peers. We guaranteed the federal agents that their primary target would be in attendance at my Winnetka estate for the duration of the evening. The SEC investigator agreed to coordinate their aggressive asset freeze directly with our timeline. They were more than happy to serve their federal warrants at a highly publicized society event, knowing the sheer shock value would prevent Blake from making any sudden, desperate attempts to flee the jurisdiction. Finally, I hired a private, highly discreet process server to assist my team. I provided him with a detailed, high-resolution photograph of Blake and explicit instructions on how to navigate the massive estate grounds during the upcoming celebration. I armed him with a thick, sealed envelope containing the newly drafted divorce filings, the undeniable graphic, photographic evidence of the hotel rendezvous, and the precise medical documentation proving my absolute biological inability to father a child. I instructed the server to wait quietly in the shadows near the grand patio, blending in seamlessly with the bustling catering staff waiting patiently for my exact verbal cue to step forward into the bright, blinding light. Everything was perfectly aligned. The immense legal trap was fully constructed. The final financial barriers were firmly set securely in stone across all banking branches, and the federal authorities were waiting patiently just outside the iron gates. Paige floated around our penthouse in a state of absolute arrogant euphoria, completely convinced she was mere days away from executing the greatest financial heist of her life. She thought she was the brilliant mastermind directing a beautiful, tragic symphony. She had absolutely no idea that she was simply a fragile marionette dancing wildly on a stage that I had built, waiting for the exact moment I decided to cut the strings and let her plummet directly into the deep dark. The day of the gala arrived with a bright, cloudless sky. My estate in Winnetka had been transformed overnight into a scene of sickening opulence. Paige had spared no expense using my budget to turn the back lawns into a wonderland of extravagance. Waiters in white tuxedos navigated the grass carrying silver trays loaded with caviar and champagne. Massive floral arrangements consisting of thousands of orchids cascaded down the stone staircases. It was a display of high society wealth designed to feed her massive ego. The entire event was a testament to her belief that she had successfully conquered me. I stood near the edge of the terrace, a glass of sparkling water in my hand, watching the wealthy elite of Chicago pour through my iron gates. 150 of the most elite influential people in the city were in attendance today. My senior managing partners, my corporate board of directors, and my closest business associates were all mingling on the lawn. They were unaware that they had been invited not to celebrate a new life, but to witness a highly calculated execution. In the center of the lawn stood my wife. Paige was holding court, surrounded by a circle of socialites. She wore a gown that draped elegantly over her frame. She looked triumphant. She threw her head back and laughed loudly at a joke someone made playing the role of the mother to perfection. Standing right next to her, oblivious to the reality of the situation, was her best friend, Erica. Erica was holding Paige by the hand, offering smiles and doting on her with affection. Erica had no idea that the woman she considered a sister was currently carrying a child fathered by her own husband. A few feet away from the women standing near the fountain was Blake Remington. He was dressed impeccably in a sharp, dark navy suit. He held a heavy crystal tumbler filled with expensive whiskey, swirling the liquid while he surveyed the party. He looked extremely relaxed, practically oozing a sickening arrogance. I watched him closely from my vantage point on the terrace. Every few minutes, whenever Erica turned her head to speak to another guest, Blake would lock eyes with Paige across the crowded lawn. They would exchange these secret smiles. It was a communication between two thieves who believed they had pulled off the greatest heist of the century. Blake raised his whiskey glass, offering a toast to my wife. He was drinking my expensive liquor, standing on my property, celebrating the fact that he was about to steal $30 million from my personal estate to save himself from a federal prison cell. My blood burned with a cold, contained fury, but my face remained an unreadable mask of polite hospitality. I spent the next hour working the crowd, shaking hands, and accepting congratulations from my corporate peers. My older son Garrett stood silently near the French doors of the main house. He had refused to attend this spectacle. He only showed up because I had called him and said to trust me. I told him he needed to be here for the final reveal. Garrett watched Paige with deeply angry eyes, entirely unaware of the massive legal trap I had set into motion. The process server I had hired was dressed in a black uniform, blending in with the event staff. Unmarked vehicles carrying federal agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission were waiting for my signal. As the bright sun began to cast shadows across the lawn, Paige decided it was finally time for the main event. She waved her manicured hand, signaling the hired event coordinator. A soft chime echoed through the sound system, drawing the attention of all 150 guests. The lively chatter slowly died down as everyone turned to look at the massive, beautifully decorated gender reveal box, sitting prominently in the center of the garden. It was tied with a giant, shimmering silk ribbon, waiting to release either bright pink or bright blue confetti into the clear sky. Paige grabbed a wireless microphone from the coordinator and beamed at the audience. "Thank you all so much for coming today. To celebrate our little miracle," she chimed, her voice dripping with fake sugary sweetness. "Richard, my darling husband, please come down here and open this beautiful box with me." The large crowd erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. I set my glass of water down on a nearby table. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit jacket and slowly walked down the stone steps toward the center of the lawn. As I slowly approached my wife, she confidently held out her free hand to me. I did not take it. I simply stepped past her and smoothly took the microphone directly from her grasp. I turned to face the massive crowd of wealthy elites, corporate board members, and treacherous friends. A hush fell over the garden. The air suddenly felt incredibly thick, charged with an unspoken heavy anticipation. I looked directly at Blake Remington, who was still standing by the fountain, his arrogant smirk still plastered across his face. Then I looked at Paige, who was standing just a few feet away, her eyes wide and shining, with greedy excitement. "Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here at my home today," I began, my voice echoing powerfully through the high-end speakers. "Your presence here means a great deal to me. As many of you know, the last few weeks have been quite an incredible emotional journey. When Paige first came into my office and told me that she was expecting a child, she called it an unbelievable family miracle." I paused for a brief moment, letting the word miracle hang heavily in the quiet afternoon air. I let my eyes slowly sweep across the faces of my trusted colleagues and friends. I wanted them to remember this exact moment forever. I wanted to ensure that the narrative was entirely under my absolute control before the chaos erupted. Paige smiled brilliantly, resting both of her hands on her flat stomach, playing her part to the very bitter end. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the tremendous weight of the past month completely lift from my shoulders. The facade of the frail, accommodating, oblivious old man was no longer necessary. I stood up straight, dropping the gentle, doting tone I had used for weeks. When I spoke again, my voice was no longer warm or inviting. It was forged from pure, unyielding steel. It was the exact ruthless tone I used when tearing apart a hostile corporate negotiation. I looked directly at my wife, watching the slight confusion begin to crack her perfect porcelain mask. "This pregnancy truly has been an incredibly eye-opening experience for me," I continued, my voice sharp and commanding, cutting through the total silence of the garden. "It has taught me a valuable lesson. It taught me that miracles do indeed happen in this world. But it also taught me that sometimes you absolutely have to firmly verify the deep hidden truth of those unexpected miracles." I watched the confident smile on Paige's face falter for just a fraction of a second. The sudden shift in my tone had caught her completely off guard, but she quickly recovered, assuming I was merely being dramatic for the sake of our distinguished guests. I turned my attention toward the massive fountain where Blake Remington was standing. I gestured toward him, offering a polite nod. I spoke directly to him into the microphone. I told the crowd that a miracle of this magnitude should be shared with our closest, most trusted confidants. I asked Blake to step forward and join my wife and me by the giant decorated box. I insisted it was only fitting he stood front and center for the grand revelation. Blake hesitated. I could see a brief, panicked calculation flashing behind his arrogant eyes. He glanced at Paige, seeking silent reassurance. She gave him a subtle, encouraging nod, completely blinded by her own greed. She thought I was simply honoring him as a valued family friend. With a forced smile, Blake walked across the grass. He stopped next to the enormous gender reveal box, standing right beside my treacherous wife. Erica followed closely behind him, beaming with genuine excitement, entirely ignorant of the slaughter she was about to witness. The three of them stood before me like actors waiting for their final cue on a brilliantly lit stage. I looked down at the massive box wrapped in shimmering silk ribbon. Then I looked back up at Paige. Her eyes were wide, practically glowing with the anticipation of the $30 million she believed she had successfully secured. I raised the microphone closer to my lips, letting the absolute silence of the garden amplify the weight of my next sentence. I spoke slowly, articulating every single syllable with devastating precision. I told the audience that this pregnancy truly was the most profound medical miracle any doctor had ever seen. I paused, letting my gaze drift from Paige to Blake and then directly into the lens of the professional videographer's camera. I announced that the miracle was mathematically and biologically impossible because 15 years ago, following the tragic passing of my first wife, I had undergone a permanent, irreversible vasectomy. The reaction was instantaneous and profoundly chaotic. A collective audible gasp echoed across the manicured lawn, rippling through the crowd of 150 elite guests. The clinking of champagne glasses stopped entirely. The soft background music seemed to vanish into the sudden suffocating vacuum of oxygen. I watched Paige's face drain of all color, transforming from a radiant flushed pink to a sickly, horrifying shade of ash white. Her jaw went completely slack, her perfectly painted lips parting in silent, paralyzed shock. Her hands, which had been lovingly resting on her flat stomach just moments prior, dropped heavily to her sides as if the muscles had been completely severed. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, completely unable to process the absolute destruction of her master plan. Blake physically staggered backward. The arrogant smirk was entirely wiped from his face, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of a man who realized he was standing on a landmine that had just detonated. His expensive whiskey splashed over the rim of his glass, staining his pristine suit pants, but he did not even notice. Erica turned to look at her husband, her brow furrowing in deep, genuine confusion, trying to comprehend the incredibly heavy implication of the medical fact I had just broadcasted to the entire city elite. Before anyone could speak, before Paige could attempt to formulate a pathetic, desperate lie to salvage the catastrophic situation, I stepped away from the microphone stand. I walked directly over to the enormous gender reveal box sitting in the center of the garden. The elegant event coordinator had instructed us to pull the giant silk ribbon together to release a magnificent cloud of pink or blue balloons. I did not wait for my wife. I grabbed the thick ribbon with one hand and violently yanked it downward. The decorative bow unraveled instantly. I grabbed the heavy cardboard flaps of the giant box and ripped them wide open, letting them fall heavily against the soft grass. The crowd leaned forward unconsciously, expecting a vibrant explosion of colored balloons to float up into the clear Chicago sky. But nothing flew out of the box. The sky remained completely empty. There were no balloons. There was no confetti. There was no celebration of new life. Instead, the massive cardboard box was filled to the absolute brim with 150 custom-printed heavy manila envelopes. They were stacked perfectly, waiting in the dark to deliver absolute ruin. I reached down into the box and pulled out the first thick envelope. The heavy, unyielding silence of the garden pressed down on us as I calmly tore open the paper flap. I reached inside and slid out a stack of premium glossy high-definition photographs. These were not grainy, ambiguous images. These were the crystal-clear, irrefutable masterpieces captured by Victor Cole's elite long-range camera lenses. I held the first photograph up high, ensuring the bright afternoon sun illuminated every single damning detail. The image perfectly captured Paige and Blake deeply embracing on the private balcony of their secluded tropical villa in St. Bart's. I tossed the glossy photo directly onto the grass at Paige's trembling feet. I pulled out a second photograph. This one depicted the two of them walking hand in hand into the discreet rear entrance of the luxury boutique hotel near Lake Michigan, taken just days after she had signed the post-nuptial agreement. I threw that picture down next to the first. I reached into the box, grabbing a massive handful of the sealed manila envelopes, and began forcefully thrusting them into the hands of the wealthy guests standing in the front row. I handed one directly to my senior managing partner. I handed another to the chairman of my corporate board. I walked straight up to Erica Remington and gently pressed an envelope directly into her trembling hands. The entire garden descended into absolute, frenzied pandemonium as the elite members of Chicago society began tearing open their personalized packages. The sound of tearing paper echoed across the lawn like a swarm of aggressive locusts. Within seconds, dozens of high-definition photographs of the illicit affair were being passed around the crowd. The pristine green grass of my estate became littered with glossy images of my wife's unforgivable treachery. I watched as the absolute reality of the situation crashed over the guests. Whispers turned into loud, indignant shouts. The carefully constructed illusion of high society elegance shattered into a million jagged pieces. I walked back to the microphone, stepping over the scattered photographs of my wife kissing another man. I picked the microphone up, my hand perfectly steady, my breathing entirely calm. I looked down at Paige, who was now visibly hyperventilating, her entire body shaking with violent, uncontrollable tremors. I looked at Blake, who was currently being cornered by his own hysterical, screaming wife. The trap had not just sprung, it had completely obliterated them. I stepped down from the small wooden platform, leaving the microphone resting on its stand. The profound silence of the garden had been entirely shattered, replaced by the frantic, tearing sounds of heavy paper. I walked deliberately through the front row of my stunned guests, holding the remaining manila envelopes in my left hand. I handed one to the chief executive of my primary investment bank. I handed another to the senior partner of my real estate firm. Every single person who opened those envelopes was met with the undeniable graphic truth of my wife's infidelity. The high-definition photographs spilled out into their hands, showcasing Paige and Blake locked in passionate embraces on foreign balconies and sneaking through the shadowy corridors of that secluded boutique hotel. The glossy images fluttered to the manicured lawn, creating a vibrant, sickening mosaic of betrayal right beneath their designer shoes. Murmurs of absolute disbelief rapidly swelled into a cacophony of shocked gasps and outraged whispers. The wealthy elite of Chicago people who had built their entire lives on managing public perception and maintaining flawless reputations were now unwilling witnesses to the most spectacular, devastating scandal this city had ever seen. I moved through them like a ghost, entirely unbothered by the rising chaos. My eyes were fixed on one specific person. I walked directly toward Erica, who was still standing completely frozen near the stone fountain. Erica looked like a woman who had just been struck by lightning. Her hands trembled violently as she stared down at the scattered photographs covering the grass around her feet. She slowly bent her knees, reaching out with shaking fingers to pick up one of the glossy images. It was a perfectly focused shot of her husband Blake pressing his lips against the neck of her supposed best friend. I stopped right in front of her. She slowly lifted her head, her eyes wide and brimming with hot, desperate tears. She looked at me silently, begging for an explanation, praying that this was some elaborate, cruel prank. I did not offer her any false comfort. I simply held out the final manila envelope. She took it from my hand, her breathing turning into short, ragged gasps. She tore the thick paper open. Inside was not just another photograph. It was a printed copy of the flight manifest Victor Cole had secured, proving unequivocally that Blake had chartered a private jet to St. Bart's during the exact same week Paige was there. The undeniable reality of the situation crashed down upon her shoulders with crushing, suffocating force. The woman she had trusted implicitly, the friend she had supported and confided in, had been actively sleeping with her husband and was now carrying his biological child. The sheer magnitude of the deception fractured Erica's mind in real time. A guttural, agonizing scream suddenly ripped through the chaotic garden. It did not sound human. It sounded like a wounded animal. Erica dropped the manila envelope and lunged forward with terrifying, blinding speed. She threw her entire body weight directly at Blake. Her manicured hands curled into tight, aggressive claws as she struck his chest wildly, scratching at his expensive navy suit. Blake stumbled backward, his crystal whiskey glass slipping from his grasp and shattering against the stone patio. He raised his arms in a desperate, pathetic attempt to shield his face from his wife's furious assault. Erica shrieked his name, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated agony. She demanded to know how he could do this to her, how he could bankrupt their lives and sleep with her best friend. Several of the male guests, including two of my senior managing partners, rushed forward to intervene. They grabbed Erica by the shoulders gently but firmly, pulling her away from her trembling husband. She continued to thrash and scream, completely uncaring of the wealthy crowd watching her public breakdown. Blake stood there, breathing heavily, his tie ruined and his face pale. He looked around the garden, making desperate eye contact with his corporate peers, silently begging for an ounce of sympathy or assistance. He found absolutely none. Every single face staring back at him held nothing but pure, unadulterated disgust. Just as Blake turned toward the iron gates, searching for a quick escape route from the absolute nightmare he had created, a tall, unremarkable man stepped out from the crowded shadows of the patio. He had been standing near the catering tables for the entire afternoon, perfectly blending in with the event staff. He did not wear a tuxedo. He wore a simple dark gray suit. He walked calmly and purposefully across the lawn, cutting through the murmuring crowd until he stood directly in front of the panicked hedge fund manager. The man reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a solid leather badge, flipping it open to display the golden seal of the federal government. He introduced himself in a loud, commanding voice as Special Agent Thomas from the Securities and Exchange Commission. He announced that he was officially executing a federal warrant. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, firmly pressing them directly against Blake's chest. Agent Thomas declared that effective immediately, every single domestic and international asset tied to Blake Remington was completely frozen under a sweeping federal securities fraud investigation. He stated that Blake was officially prohibited from leaving the state of Illinois, and that federal marshals were currently seizing his corporate offices downtown. The realization of his absolute inescapable ruin hit Blake like a physical blow. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the edge of the stone fountain, burying his face in his trembling hands. His secret getaway funds were completely gone. His freedom was entirely gone. I turned my gaze away from the ruined man and looked back at my treacherous wife. Paige was kneeling on the grass, surrounded by the scattered photographs of her infidelity. Her perfect white designer maternity dress was stained with dirt and spilled champagne. She was frantically gathering the pictures, desperately trying to hide them from the judging eyes of the crowd, as if picking them up could somehow erase the devastating truth. When she saw me watching her, she stopped gathering the photos. A sudden manic light flared in her tear-filled eyes. Her panic briefly morphed into a bizarre, delusional form of arrogant defiance. She scrambled to her feet, pointing a shaking finger directly at my chest. She screamed that none of this humiliating public spectacle actually mattered, because she had already won. She shrieked that I had legally signed the irrevocable family trust agreement that very morning. She loudly reminded the entire shocked crowd that she was the sole managing trustee of $30 million, and that my money now belonged entirely to her unborn child. She yelled that she would safely take my massive fortune, divorce me immediately, and leave me completely rotting in my empty penthouse while she lived in absolute luxury. She stood there panting heavily, clutching her stomach like an impenetrable shield, completely convinced that her grand financial victory was perfectly secure and totally untouched by this dramatic, deeply public exposure unfolding today. I looked at Paige as she desperately clung to her imaginary financial safety net. She genuinely believed that the legal documents we signed that very morning were her ultimate salvation. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic screaming. I simply turned my head and offered a subtle nod toward the edge of the stone patio. Langdon Cross stepped forward from the shadows of the garden. My elite corporate attorney was dressed in a pristine charcoal suit, looking entirely unbothered by the absolute chaos swirling around him. He carried a sleek black leather portfolio under his arm. The murmuring crowd parted instinctively, allowing him to walk directly up to the wooden platform. I handed the microphone over to him. Langdon adjusted his glasses and opened the leather portfolio. He looked out over the stunned audience of wealthy elites, federal agents, and my hyperventilating wife. He introduced himself with a calm, authoritative cadence, stating his positions as my primary legal counsel. Then he addressed Paige directly. He informed her that there seemed to be a profound, catastrophic misunderstanding regarding the documents she had so eagerly signed. Paige stopped screaming, her breath hitched in her throat as she stared up at the formidable attorney. Langdon pulled a thick, legally certified document from his portfolio. It was the exact irrevocable family trust agreement she had been bragging about just moments prior. He flipped through the heavy pages with deliberate slowness, making her wait in agonizing suspense. He stopped at page 47. Langdon cleared his throat and began to read the specific buried clause aloud to the entire silent garden. His voice resonated clearly through the high-end speakers. He read the stipulation that the $30 million trust fund would only activate if I was definitively verified as the biological father of the child. He emphasized the mandate requiring a court-admissible independent DNA paternity test. Then he read the final fatal sentence. He declared that if the biological match was not an absolute certainty, the trust would be rendered immediately null and void, and the designated managing trustee would be permanently stripped of all administrative rights and claims. The devastating weight of those legal words crashed down upon Paige like a collapsing building. I had already provided irrefutable medical documentation proving my permanent vasectomy. The biological match she needed to unlock those $30 million was a mathematical impossibility. The trust fund she had traded her entire life to secure was absolutely worthless. It was nothing more than a pile of empty paper. Paige let out a ragged, choking gasp, stumbling backward, as if the very air had been sucked from her lungs. She shook her head frantically, in total denial. She yelled that it did not matter that she was still legally my wife and that she would hire her own aggressive lawyers to take half of my entire real estate empire in a highly contested divorce court. I stepped back up to the microphone, standing shoulder to shoulder with my attorney. I looked down at the woman who had planned to use my legacy as a bailout fund for a federal criminal. I spoke with a quiet, lethal precision. I reminded her of the second document she had signed that very morning. I reminded her of the comprehensive post-nuptial asset separation agreement. I watched the realization slowly, painfully click into place behind her wide, terrified eyes. I explained to the crowd that by voluntarily signing that specific document, she had legally waived any and all rights to spousal alimony. She had completely surrendered all claims to my real estate portfolio, my domestic and international bank accounts, and my shares in the commercial real estate empire I had spent 40 years building. She had signed away her ultimate safety net, out of pure, unadulterated greed. She had been so completely blinded by the giant $30 million figure on the trust fund cover that she had eagerly locked herself into a financial prison. She traded my genuine wealth for a mirage. I told her that she was walking away from our marriage with absolutely nothing but the clothes currently on her back. There would be no lengthy contested divorce battles. There would be no massive settlement payouts. There would be no comfortable safety net to catch her. She was entirely and permanently cut off from my fortune. Paige collapsed onto the manicured grass. The flawless illusion of her high society dominance was completely shattered. She buried her face in her hands, weeping with a raw, ugly desperation that echoed across the lawn. Her wealthy friends, the same women she had lied to and manipulated, simply stared at her with expressions of profound disgust. Even Erica Remington, who was still recovering from the shock of her own husband's betrayal, turned her back on her former best friend. Paige was completely isolated, stripped of her stolen wealth, and publicly humiliated in front of the entire city elite. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for her. She had orchestrated an incredibly malicious, calculated heist against my life. She had planned to treat me like a disposable stepping stone. I turned my attention back to the microphone for the final time. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the estate grounds. I looked directly at Paige, ensuring my voice carried the absolute unyielding finality of a judge delivering a permanent sentence. "You have exactly 60 minutes to pack your personal clothes and leave my property," I said coldly. "If you are not gone by the time the clock strikes the hour, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." As soon as the words left my mouth, a team of private security guards stepped out from the shadows of the main house. They were dressed in immaculate black suits, moving with swift, synchronized efficiency. Two of the imposing guards walked directly over to Paige. They firmly grabbed her by the arms, pulling her up from the grass, and began escorting her toward the front gates. Two other guards moved to assist the federal agents who were currently detaining Blake Remington. The disgraced hedge fund manager was pale, completely silent, and physically shaking as they led him away from the stone fountain. As the security team marched the two exposed traitors toward the perimeter of my estate, the heavy iron gates slowly swung open. A swarm of local press and aggressive media photographers, whom I had deliberately tipped off earlier that morning, were waiting hungrily on the street outside. The bright, blinding flashes of their camera lenses erupted like rapid gunfire. They captured every single humiliating second of Paige and Blake being unceremoniously ejected from the property. The brutal, undeniable reality of their absolute downfall was being permanently documented for the entire world to see. They had tried to destroy me in the dark. I had chosen to destroy them in the brightest light imaginable. I stood proudly on the wooden platform and watched them vanish into the chaotic, roaring crowd. The toxic infection was finally gone. My legacy was firmly secured. The long game was over, and I had definitively won it all today. Exactly 1 month later, the frantic dust of that spectacular afternoon had finally settled. The chaotic headlines featuring my treacherous former wife and her bankrupt lover had slowly faded from the relentless local news cycles, replaced by the mundane rhythm of everyday city life. I found myself sitting quietly on the expansive private balcony of my downtown penthouse, breathing in the crisp, cooling air, blowing off the vast surface of Lake Michigan. The profound silence enveloping my home was no longer heavy with suspicion or toxic deceit. It was a clean, absolute peace that I had fiercely fought to secure. Sitting directly across from me in a matching leather armchair was my older son, Garrett. For the first time in over 5 agonizing years, there was no invisible wall of hostility standing between us. We were no longer separated by the manipulative lies of a woman who had sought to destroy our bloodline for her own financial gain. I reached forward and carefully poured us each a generous measure of 18-year-old premium scotch into heavy crystal tumblers. The rich amber liquid caught the fading golden sunlight as I handed a glass to the son I had foolishly doubted. I looked Garrett directly in his eyes and offered him the most sincere, unconditional apology of my entire life. I told him how deeply sorry I was for ever allowing a calculated parasite to cloud my fundamental judgment and fracture our family bond. I admitted that his initial warnings about her true nature had been completely accurate from the very beginning. Garrett took a slow sip of his scotch, nodding with a quiet, dignified understanding. He did not boast or demand any further vindication. He simply told me he was profoundly relieved to finally have his real father back today. As we sat together sharing the expensive liquor, we discussed the absolute wreckage that had befallen the two people who tried to steal our legacy. The destruction of Blake Remington had been incredibly swift and entirely merciless. Following his highly public arrest at my garden gala, the federal government had officially unsealed the massive securities fraud indictment against him. He was systematically stripped of every single remaining asset and is currently sitting in a federal detention center, facing up to 20 years in a maximum security prison. His entire empire of lies had collapsed under the crushing weight of justice. His humiliated wife, Erica, had reacted with a level of ruthlessness that even I had to quietly admire. Within 24 hours of the disastrous gender reveal party, she had officially filed for a highly contested divorce. Utilizing her family's vast generational wealth and their army of elite corporate lawyers, she successfully froze him out of every single penny he thought he could ever access. She ensured that when Blake eventually emerged from his lengthy federal prison sentence, he would be stepping into a world where he possessed absolutely nothing. He would be entirely broke, permanently disgraced, and completely alone. The fate of my former wife was equally catastrophic. After being unceremoniously escorted off my Winnetka estate by private security, she had desperately attempted to hire aggressive attorneys to invalidate the post-nuptial agreement she had signed. She genuinely thought she could still manipulate the legal system to extract millions from my real estate portfolio. But the moment her lawyers reviewed the airtight documentation drafted by Langdon Cross, alongside the clear audio recordings detailing her explicit intent to commit massive financial fraud, they immediately dropped her case. No credible law firm would ever touch such a highly toxic disaster. She was left heavily pregnant, entirely broke, and completely cut off from the glamorous high society world she had tried so desperately to rob. The wealthy elite circles of Chicago immediately blacklisted her, closing their doors to the woman who had brought such a vulgar, humiliating scandal into their pristine lives. She was ultimately forced to move into a cheap, cramped rental apartment on the far outskirts of the city. She is currently preparing to raise a child entirely alone, while the biological father prepares to spend the next 2 decades locked inside a heavily guarded federal penitentiary facility today. I felt absolutely no remorse for her devastating current situation. She had willingly orchestrated an incredibly malicious, highly calculated heist against my life. She had planned to treat me like a disposable, clueless stepping stone, completely willing to leave me broken and financially drained. She had eagerly dug her own shallow grave using nothing but her own unadulterated greed as a shovel. I simply allowed her to willingly step inside and bury herself. The universe has a remarkably poetic way of delivering absolute justice when you simply provide the wicked with enough rope to finally hang their arrogant selves now. Garrett and I finished our drinks as the bright sun dipped below the distant horizon, casting long, peaceful shadows across the penthouse balcony. We stood up and walked back inside to my formal mahogany study. Waiting on the polished desk was a thick stack of brand-new corporate legal documents. These were not deceptive trust funds or fraudulent contracts. They were the meticulously drafted succession papers designed to officially realign my entire commercial real estate empire. I picked up my heavy gold pen and smoothly signed my name permanently, transferring a significant controlling portion of the company to Garrett today. We were officially securing the massive family legacy for the coming generations, ensuring the empire would be safely managed by someone who possessed genuine loyalty, exceptional competence, and authentic respect. Handing those signed documents to my son felt like closing a painful, chaotic chapter and opening a beautiful, highly promising new volume. The immense wealth I had spent 4 decades building was finally safe. It was no longer a vulnerable target for opportunistic vultures looking for a rapid, unearned payday. It was an ironclad fortress protected by the impenetrable bond of real blood and fierce lessons of hard experience now. I walked over to the expansive glass windows of the study, looking out over the brilliantly illuminated Chicago streets below. At 70 years old, I had learned a remarkably profound lesson about the true nature of human loyalty. I learned that you absolutely cannot purchase genuine devotion, and you certainly should never blindly trust miraculous events that seem fundamentally too good to be practically true. I built my massive commercial empire utilizing my own 2 hands, relying on sharp intuition, relentless discipline, and a complete refusal to ever surrender to those who wished to see my sudden, catastrophic downfall happen. I protected my personal life and my hard-earned legacy using the exact same unyielding methodology. I refused to be a quiet victim. I refused to let a calculated parasite dismantle the life I had so painstakingly constructed. The pain of the initial betrayal was entirely eclipsed by the tremendous, empowering satisfaction of claiming absolute, undeniable victory. I survived the darkest deception by transforming my vulnerability into an unstoppable strategic weapon. I am standing taller and stronger today than I ever have in my entire life, ready to embrace the peaceful, authentic future I have finally and permanently secured forever. This story is a stark reminder that greed always leaves a paper trail. In high society circles, parasites often mistake a man's kindness and silence for absolute weakness. They assume old age clouds judgment, making you a soft target for calculated heists disguised as family miracles. But true power always lies in strategic patience. Never confront a devastating betrayal with empty words or raw emotion. Protect your empire by using the absolute precision of the law, ironclad post, nuptial agreements, and strict financial boundaries. True family is earned through genuine loyalty and mutual respect, never through deceit, manipulation, or entitlement. If you found cold satisfaction in how I protected my life's work and dismantled these parasites, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel to never miss our next story of absolute justice. Drop a comment below showing where you are watching from, See you next time around.